we're in business. Recording is in progress, as we are all informed. So there we are. If you don't want to have imagery or sound put into the recording, then, you know, ooh, my phone's going to jump off the desk. That was not what I was expecting. Then mute yourself in the appropriate way now so you don't end up in the recording. But of course, we are going to be entirely fine with editing anything out if we need to anyway. So it's obviously easier if we don't have to edit things out. So that's all good if anything is surprising. We're just going to wait for a few more minutes because in terms of software supply chains, people may be updating their Zoom clients as they try to connect to the webinar.
Very topical.
Indeed. Well, particularly given Zoom forces you to do it on the way in now, then that's, that's a slight change if you're expecting to jump onto a meeting quickly.
Yeah, that was my problem. I was trying to get in a bit earlier and I had to do a whole upload, download and inload to get past the Google bugs.
That's right, exactly. That's right. The gremlins of the various different sorts. But it is very interesting to see. I mean, that's obviously for a software package like Zoom that everyone uses all over the world a lot. One really needs to be pretty careful about the way that security is managed. And of course, don't get us started on the Internet of Things and how security needs to protect us from what's going to happen in the gremlin space of all of that. In the meantime, I'm going to stop my share of the poster because I'm essentially preaching to the converted. We're all here anyway, and that will also smooth the transition to sharing from our speakers, but we'll just wait for another minute and then we'll get into the material. Well, I'll introduce first.
While we're waiting for potential attendees, did anyone see the news tonight? They were talking about 2 New Zealanders who are providing Veracity style guidelines to international markets.
That's good. What's the context of that?
Well, I didn't actually, unfortunately, catch much. I was cooking dinner, but
upgrading Zoom.
The issue was that in the world, it seems that there's a lot of AI, and New Zealand is producing guidelines about how AI should be used.
That's very good. Yeah, that's interesting. That's certainly rapidly growing in terms of impact. We're seeing that even just in the university, the sort of proliferation of policies and guidelines and things related to AI. But it's good to hear that we've got New Zealanders doing that, but certainly we'd be very pleased to get involved too, I'm sure, many of us.
Yeah, it's Sir Peter Gluckman and the Koitu Research Centre at Auckland. So he and one of his colleagues have, through the International Science Council, have put that together. So that's, yeah, it's good to see. But yeah, I've downloaded it to have a read.
Excellent. Yes, I mean, as I always end up bringing up, my go-to for this is what's happening with the European Union, and so the AI Act happening there is my kind of lightning rod of regulation that's upcoming. Good. Okay, so let's get started. It's now 5 past the hour. We're recording already, so no one else has joined in the meantime. Oh, but someone is. That's the way Zoom works. As soon as you say something about people joining, then someone else joins. But yeah, tena koutou to everyone here, and as you'll notice, it is being recorded tonight, but we can obviously edit out anything if there's a problem. I am David Ayres, as it says in my kind of Zoom annotation, and my role here is just to facilitate this meeting, essentially chairing it, but I'm sure we definitely have experienced presenters here, so I don't think I'm going to have a particularly problematic job. I'm watching the Zoom chat, and also both Jens and Tim have said that they're happy to take questions during their talk as well, so we can just see what the tenor is of what we want to park for discussion at the end and what we want to talk about during the actual presentation of material. To provide a bit of an introduction to the context for those that don't know, although I suspect the majority do, we are speaking as researchers connected with a National Science Challenge funded project. So it's through the Science for Technological Innovation. We have been running a 3-year project, the Veracity Spearhead, that has explored all sorts of different aspects of veracity in all sorts of different definitions. and has had a focus on supply chain veracity. That supply chain was, from the proposal, focused on aspects of, say, we've examined things like organic wine and other kind of food-based supply chains, physical goods. But of course, software is something that has a supply chain as well. And so tonight is focusing on where supply chain dynamics applies to software. The particular emphasis there that's been key is there's been a rapid attention on the sort of software supply chain, particularly with respect to cybersecurity, and that's relevant to both of the talks we'll hear tonight. One of the catalysts for that has been the White House executive order that happened in 2021. So although that's focusing on the federal government of the US's use of software, it definitely drew attention to the notion of the software bill of materials, which is a concept that's included in Jens's talk. So these kinds of ideas about, with a whole section focusing on the security of software supply chain, this is now a big deal, and there have been a number of big security problems that the software supply chain is responsible for in some sense. So we need to try to improve the situation there. The two talks that we'll hear tonight will have about 15 minutes or so each. Won't be that worried about the strictness of that timing because we've got the hour as it is. We've got allocated a 5-minute question time afterwards, but we can just see how the questions actually work there, and then some open discussion that can happen after that time. And to introduce the two speakers, which I'll do now so that I don't then interrupt so much the flow when we're going. Tim White is a senior research engineer, research software engineer with the Veracity project. Tim's only been with the project for a relatively short space of time, but has already had a significant positive impact. So this is definitely a very good thing. This is also, heating up your seat, Tim, before you present to everyone, but the impact has been greatly appreciated, and having the maturity of coming from the real world and then bringing the kind of software engineering that you can do with the kind of academic agenda, but with real delivery timelines, has been extremely useful. And you've been working closely with Jens, which has worked very effectively there. And then Jens Dietrich is an associate professor at Victoria University of Wellington. So is does various things, but software engineering aspects is sort of one summary that I would take. Jens also has this kind of knack of, whilst being an academic researcher, still managing to do stuff that has a lot of real world impact, which is not always the case. There are many that end up kind of going up into the ivory tower, and Jens has got a refreshing way of being able to do high impact academic work while still actually producing real world useful stuff at the same time. So there you go. That's your seat heated up too, Jens. But first of all, we're going to talk we'll hear from Tim, and Tim is going to focus on detecting vulnerable software components in software, and I won't spoil the abstract or anything there. Tim, I'll let you instead share your screen, and we can start your presentation.
Okay.
I'm going to mute my audio so that I don't accidentally sneeze at an inappropriate moment.
All right. Can everyone see? Good.
It's all good.
Great. So thank you for those kind words, Dave. I'll be talking about detecting vulnerable software components, as Dave said. This is work Jens, myself, from Veracity Spearhead have been working on. Also, a couple of other collaborators, Sean Rashid and Alexander Jordan. Okay, so just a quick overview of what we'll be going over. Some recent exploits to get everybody suitably paranoid, and then I'll be describing kind of the software landscape as it stands at the moment, and what our new tool does at a high level to improve things. So recent exploits, why we should be worried. First, just a couple of terms. Maybe people already know this stuff, but just in case. So the basics are vulnerabilities and exploits. A vulnerability in software terms is any sort of weakness in a program that makes it vulnerable to any kind of attack from any kind of bad actor. Vulnerabilities, nowadays, there's so many of them that they pile up inside various databases, and they quite often get a name or a tag number like CVE and then 8 digits after that or so. And an exploit is really just a way of exploiting a vulnerable program, figuring out how to give that program input to get it to do what you, as the bad guy in this scenario, want it to do and what the people who made it don't want you to do. So one very gnarly type of exploit is remote code execution. And essentially that means the bad guy has the ability to make your computer do anything that you can make it do. So in particular, they might be able to read your files, including any sort of secret information, personal information that you've got stored on your hard drive, so passwords, that sort of thing. They could impersonate you. They could delete all of your data if they so wanted. So it's pretty bad. You really don't want that kind of exploit happening. And that's exactly what happened to Equifax in 2017. Now, Equifax is one of the big three US credit bureaus. A credit bureau, as you may know, is basically an organization that exists to gather as much data about you as they possibly can so that they can answer other people's questions about whether you're a financial risk or not. So they have a lot of data on people. And back in March of 2017, a security researcher discovered a vulnerability in one of the components that is used by Equifax and used by many pieces of software, which I won't go into the details, but essentially if you uploaded a carefully constructed file to a server running this vulnerable software, you could get RCE, you could get remote code execution on that server. Now, typically, as soon as a notification goes out that a vulnerability has been discovered, it's on everybody to patch their systems, update them with the fix. But 2 months went by, and in May, it was discovered that close to 148 million Americans, which is about 45% of the US population, had all of their personal data breached, made available to the highest bidder. All kinds of stuff, social security numbers, addresses. There were quite a few. I mean, there were also 15 million Britons and I think something close to 1 million Canadians as well. It was bad news. So the next one that I'll talk about is a very, very large scale vulnerability, Log4Shell. This was discovered in 2021. So all serious programs perform logging, basically keeping a list of things that they've done and when they happened. And if you use the Java programming language, then the most popular Java logging library is Log4j. And somebody discovered that you can actually make Log4j run arbitrary code that you provide under very broad circumstances. It turns out that this vulnerability actually had existed for about 8 years prior to being actually discovered. But essentially, because of how widespread this software is, Log4j, with some estimates putting the figure at 93% of all enterprise cloud software being vulnerable, that has to be Java enterprise software, it's been called the most severe vulnerability ever. So for a period there, it was basically allowing anybody to do anything on a huge fraction of the world's computers. And why does this seem to be ramping up? Why now? And essentially the answer to that is that the world is more connected than it has been in the past, especially the business world. And programs are also becoming more modular than ever, which in general is a good thing. It has many good aspects for software engineering, but in terms of software security, there are risks as well, threats as well. Okay, so let's go a little bit into modern software ecosystems. So in general, regardless of what computer language you're using, programming language, software nowadays tends to use components that are published in some large central repository. And this is a good thing. That means that it's possible to build on the backs of other people's work, and you can make very quick progress. And people will generally use build systems to make their own programs. People use build systems that do dependency tracking. So you will essentially write your own code and list all of the pieces of other people's code that your code depends on, and the build system will automatically go away and download all of that. And if those things have dependencies themselves, then those will be downloaded on top of that, and so on and so on. And it can get very deep, actually. Yeah, and there are jokes in the JavaScript world, at least, about how deep it can get. So what happens when a vulnerability is discovered? A researcher discovers that some particular version of some library, let's say, is vulnerable, publishes that in a database. And the question that everybody has at that point, every programmer, is my code affected? Is my system affected? And what arose in response to that need for information? The first responders to that essentially were software composition analysis tools, SCA tools. And there's quite a variety of those available now. Probably the most familiar one to a lot of people who are programmers is Dependabot on GitHub, which is a very familiar one. And essentially what SCA tools do is they look at the dependency structure of your code and look at a database recording which modules are known to be vulnerable to which exploits, and detects whether any of those vulnerable modules are anywhere in the dependency tree of your code. And what's good about them is that they run very quickly. I've written their dependencies of tree structures. That's not quite true. They're DAGs, really, but they're still nice graph structures, and computers love trees and DAGs, directed acyclic graphs. So also they tend to be made in a way that's easy to use. Dependabot certainly makes it very easy. If there's a new version of a module that you depend on, which has fixed the vulnerability, essentially Dependabot puts a button in front of you which you can click and automatically upgrade to get that version. And it couldn't really be more simple than that. But on the other hand, they have some known problems too. So in particular, they tend to give false positives because of the way they work. Let's say that somebody creates a software module called Carrot, which can show a carrot on the screen, hide a carrot, and maybe do some other things. Maybe there's a function there to delete the logs of all the carrot hiding and showing that it's done. And someone discovers that the delete logs function is vulnerable. It can give somebody access or delete a file accidentally that you don't want deleted. That will go in a database, and the SCA tool will flag anything that uses Carrot as being potentially vulnerable. However, if somebody later creates another module which depends on Carrot, but never actually calls that delete logs function that's vulnerable, and thus could never actually trigger that dangerous behavior, the SCA tool doesn't know that because it doesn't do that level of analysis. And so it will actually label that module as vulnerable as well. And that's a false positive. So that's essentially noise to people who are working with the system. And the problem is that travels, that moves transitively through the whole dependency graph. And so any other module, application, or library module that people create that depends on, in this case, Vegmatic, which we already actually know is not vulnerable, that will be flagged as being vulnerable by a typical SCA tool as well. So those become false positives too. And the number of false positives just grow and grow. And that's a burden on software maintainers. What's possibly less well appreciated is that existing SCA tools have a blind spot as well. That is, they have several blind spots, but that is that there are vulnerabilities that they will miss, that they don't pick up that they possibly should, or we would like them to. And essentially, the one that's very hard to get around is if you have everything laid out neatly in your dependency file, listing all of the modules that your code depends on, it can just look them up in a database. But what if instead of actually depending on that code, which via the dependency mechanism, what if you just copy and paste that existing code directly into your project? Then there's no record that that code came from there. And so SCA tools don't know that it originated from there. and they are helpless to notice that it's vulnerable in that case. And you could go even further. You could, for example, rename a few functions or variables or modules, whatever, to make it even less clear the origin of that code. Now, why would you do such a thing? You might do it accidentally. Programmers here will be well aware that we are trained very hard to be dry, to follow the principle of don't repeat yourself. Whenever you want something, if you can possibly refer to an existing instance of that thing, always do that in preference to creating a fresh copy. Because as soon as you create a fresh copy, if you need to change the original or the fresh copy, you need to remember to change the other one as well. And that's a maintenance burden. So we prefer to always refer to things. And that's why copy pasting is frowned upon. But on the other hand, Java and many other environments have a situation called class path hell, which might be familiar to people as DLL hell, especially from older versions of Windows. Essentially, the problem is, what if your program depends on two things, and each of those things depend on a third thing, but they each want different versions of that third thing? In most systems, you can only have one version of that third thing running or included in the project. And in that case, you hit a roadblock. And this is generally called DLL hell or class path hell in the case of Java. So what we do is we copy and paste and rename things. And we think of it as being the right thing to do. And actually, it can be the right thing to do. I was going to say it's a state of mind as to whether copy and paste and rename is a good thing or a bad thing. But it's a bad thing in some ways, but it's certainly a good thing when it comes to resolving this class path hell issue. And that's really all shading is: copying, pasting, and renaming the package. And that means that it's possible to get past the situation I described earlier. So just a very quick overview of Java, which is the environment where our tool Shade Detector runs. Java is a popular language. A lot of people who use Java use Maven as the build tool. And Maven, just a very quick summary, you write a file called pom.xml, which is where you list all of your dependencies that your code needs. And generally speaking, you will pull those dependencies from Maven Central Repo, which is an enormous repo out in the world containing lots and lots of useful code. I think we don't really need to go through the glossary too much. The important things are right at the bottom there, actually. POV and TPOV, proof of vulnerability and template proof of vulnerability. A proof of vulnerability is just a piece of code that will demonstrate whether the underlying code is vulnerable or not. It gives you a hard yes or no. And a template proof of vulnerability, we'll come to that in a second, what that means. So our tool is called Shade Detector. And as you might guess from the name, the goal is to illuminate this blind spot that is currently missed by existing SCA tools. So it goes beyond this dependency metadata that's in the pom.xml file. And essentially what it does is you give it a vulnerability, which will be identified by one of these CVE numbers. You give it a Maven artifact that is known to be vulnerable to that vulnerability, and we call that the template artifact. And you give it a proof of vulnerability that proves that artifact is vulnerable to that vulnerability. And what it will then do is it will go through it will try to find as many projects as it can on Maven Central that are also vulnerable to that same vulnerability, even though there is no dependency record connecting them to the original vulnerable artifact. And it has some nice features like it doesn't need to build a big index. And it doesn't need to download Maven Central, which would be impossible. It's 40-something terabytes. So I won't go too much into the details of how it actually works, but essentially what we look for is we look for unusual class names in the Java code itself. And I will actually skip over that. I will. It seems I've actually, sorry, I've deleted the wrong slide. So when you perform shading in Java, you will rename the package, which is almost, you can think of that as the directory almost, but you will generally not rename the classes in that directory, the files in that directory. And what Shade Detector does is it looks for unusual class names in the template artifact. And Java programmers love to create long, unwieldy class names consisting of a bunch of words smashed together. And we will choose those in preference, scan through Maven Central Repo for classes that match those. And then we will try to find other artifacts in the repo that have multiple matching class names. And we consider those as being candidates that are clones of the original template artifact. We then essentially do some extra checking through a pipeline where we, first of all, find the good class names. We get them all back. We combine them to find matching artifacts. We do some more processing steps, culminating in essentially rebuilding the original proof of vulnerability test for the new candidate vulnerable artifact, and then we run the test. And this gives us, what this finds for us essentially is a whole bunch of vulnerable artifacts out there that haven't been found before. And probably the takeaway from this slide is right at the bottom there, 10 GHSA PRs accepted. A GHSA, that's the GitHub security alert. Those are public records of vulnerabilities that are available and paid attention to by a lot of programmers, working programmers. And so we have identified 10 instances of existing vulnerabilities that have affected 86 different projects that weren't known about before. And in this graph, we can just see how as you proceed from left to right and the filtering is applied, you start with many possible candidates and you filter them out until just a few remain. But we do find a significant number that remain. And importantly, if you look at this rightmost column, any, we have a row for each different vulnerability, and the column total, second from the left, that's how many we find. And any is how many are found by any of the existing tools. And you'll see that while there are some rows where there is some tool that finds the same number of vulnerabilities that we find, there are many cases where we find more, in some cases dramatically more. So we get 727 vulnerable artifacts in comparison to existing SCA tools, which between them find only 149. And so this work is in a paper which we've recently submitted for publication. And if anybody has any questions on this, please feel free to ask.
Good, thank you very much, Tim. That's excellent to see. I'm jumping in now because I think in the interest of time, we want to make sure that Jens, your talk fits within the first hour, definitely. So what I'm going to call for, I'd say keep the questions in mind. I have some to raise as well. But if anyone has any clarifications that would really benefit from Tim being able to pull up a slide right now, just let me know, because otherwise I think we can move to Jens, your talk, and then we can come back and do all of that discussion together just to make it all fit. So if anyone wants to shout or virtually raise your hand or jump on chat, any of these things, please do so. Otherwise, we will hold the questions until the end. Okay, so I think I've talked over anyone's opportunity to be able to ask questions yet. We'll come back to all of that afterwards. And in the meantime, Jens, thank you very much if you want to take it over on the other talk topic. And I'm going to mute myself again.
Yeah, thanks, David. Can you all see the slides?
Yes, I keep muting myself before saying yes.
Yeah,
It's all
sound
good.
okay? Cool, yeah. Yeah, so thanks for coming here at this late hour. So I will talk about basically building binaries, and I will clarify in a moment what it means. It's work I've done in collaboration with Tim, but also Benas and Mohammed. Benas is a researcher at Industry Lab at Oracle Labs in Brisbane, and Mohammed is from the University of Waterloo. And it's work supported by Sifty, of course, but also by through gift by Oracle Labs Australia. So there was a reference earlier to cooking dinner. Let's maybe start with this. So, okay, so sorry, my remote didn't quite work. So let's start with cooking dinner. So if you like cooking as I do, then you know that the secret to cooking a good meal is two things. It's good ingredients and a good process. And even if you don't like cooking, if you like eating, you probably know about this as well. And cooking secure software is really just like this. So we have on the one side, we have the ingredients, and that is source code as well as those pre-manufactured components Tim just talked about. And something can go wrong there. So Equifax and Log4Shell are those two vulnerabilities or incidents Tim has mentioned. That's really when the ingredients were bad. I want to focus on the second part. That's really the process. So it's about building, deploying, distributing software. I talk about this in a moment. And things can also go wrong there. And there are a couple of very famous incidents in this space as well. I briefly will talk about, such as SolarWinds and XZ. So what building software means is really the following. So the way we often think about software is that we have some programmers, they interact with real world people, with customers, with clients, giving them requirements, and they produce source code. But that's of course not the end of the story, because source code typically cannot be executed on a computer. So it has to be translated into some executable format. And that process is often called compiling it. But in a way, it's not just about compiling this, there's a bit more to it now. So there are additional elements of this process, such as testing, maybe generating additional code, a process called linking. And all of this together really forms this quite complex process of translating source code into an executable you can run on a computer, on a cell phone, and so on and so forth. And it doesn't actually start there, because even if you have this, you have to go one step further. So you have to publish said program in binary format, executable format, into some sort of app store or into onto the cloud computers where the programs are executed. So what we have really seen in the last 10 to 15 years is that initially software engineers became more and more frustrated by the complexity of those routine processes to build the software and to deploy them, to deliver them to their customers. So there was a lot of investment in really automating those last two steps of the process. And you might have heard about DevOps. So entire new job roles were created really to facilitate that space and to automate those routine tasks. Continuous integration, continuous deployment, and all of those techniques really fit into this overall picture. And the key idea was really to allow software engineers to focus on the creative task, on the not routine task, that is to create source code and then to automate everything from there on. So that has, in a way, been packaged with some assumptions. And the assumption by software engineers has been, until recently, that if you produce code and you can trust the code, you can trust the code in the sense that your code is secure, that it doesn't have vulnerabilities, then that carries forward to the binaries produced from the code, and from the binaries you basically put in your app store or install on a remote computer. So we inferred trust through this chain one by one. Even though, even 15 years ago, we should have known better that we shouldn't have done this, because there was a famous talk in the 80s by Ken Thompson, which is now often referred to as a Ken Thompson hack. So Ken Thompson is a computer scientist, and he won the Turing Medal, which is Nobel Prize equivalent in computer science. And he basically, in his award speech, talked about a compiler that inserted a backdoor, so a security flaw, into all programs it compiled, including itself. So that's often now referred to as a Ken Thompson hack. So that was seen as a curiosity without expectations that that would ever be seen in the real world. But with the level of automation we now see in build processes, it was only a matter of time until that started to surface. And now the reality is that instead of being able to infer that when the code is secure, everything else from there on is secure, we basically have to make the assumptions that the binaries might be insecure and what we push into the app stores might also be insecure, and therefore create damage in the real world with economic social implications. So we started to see a couple of incidents in the wild starting around 10 years ago, but the one that really brought this to everybody's attention was an incident called SolarWinds in 2019-20. So SolarWinds is American company that produces a product called Orion that manages IT resources. So big companies or big organizations run the software to see we have a set number of servers, and they use network resources, and they are networked and connected in a certain way, and all those things. And there was a malware that was installed in the build process of this Orion software. It watched for builds, inserted a backdoor through a temporary source code file when builds took place, and then opened the backdoor to be exploited by attackers. And that was used to attack the Department of Defense, Department of Justice in the US, Treasury, Cisco, Intel, Microsoft, and a couple of other really big organizations, in particular ministries in the US, and it has widely been attributed to the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. A second attack I quickly want to mention is XZ. It's actually not really an attack. It's an attempted attack. It hasn't been exploited in the wild, as far as I know. That is related to an open source project called XZ. That's a compression library that's widely used in some of the most widely used Linux distributions. Linux underpins modern cloud computing and underpins Android as well. So it was preceded, so the attack is very, very recent. It took place about 4 weeks ago, and it was preceded by a very sophisticated social engineering attacks that started around 21, when some open source contributors tried to first make benign contributions to an open source project, and then step by step took over the administration of this open source project and made more and more radical changes, including installing a backdoor. And that was only really accidentally discovered by a Microsoft engineer who fine-tuned some software and realized that there were a few more CPU cycles when he fine-tuned the performance, and he wondered what those additional CPU cycles were doing. And so he analyzed this, and basically he ended up finding the malware before it was widely deployed. But now everybody is now wondering how much other software like this is there out there that hasn't been detected, because it has been so sophisticated and was so difficult to detect. So the attackers also disabled some quality assurance tools that would have potentially detected it, like Google OSS Fuzz is one of those tools, and it was a really, really interesting attack. So there was a good feature on Hard Fork, which is a New York Times technology podcast, about a week ago, if you're interested in the backstory. So what are now the countermeasures for to prevent attacks like this and to deal with vulnerabilities like this? So one of the key ideas there is provenance, to record build processes and to create files and put them in an immutable database, so that we create enough evidence for forensic audits, for instance, if an attack took place, to figure out how the attack was able to exploit weaknesses, how those weaknesses came into the supply chains. So another idea is to make builds reproducible, to maybe build multiple times and compare the results to see whether there's some variation in the results. And I will talk about this in more detail in a moment. There is an industry-wide initiative to attack this on a larger scale, or to prevent those vulnerabilities on a larger scale. That's referred to as SALSA. That stands for Supply Chain Levels of Software Artifacts. It's a standard that is derived from some engineering practices developed at Google, and the idea is that builds follow some sort of maturity level, and the lowest maturity level is ad hoc builds. Then you go to builds that collect provenance data to enable auditing. Then you go to builds that are hosted, so run by a third independent party, and then to builds that are hardened, that use additional quality assurance analysis tools in order to detect vulnerabilities. And you might remember there was slide 2 when I compared the ingredients in the process of building secure software. So as far as ingredients are concerned, there's a key piece of technology that is widely thought to facilitate the detection of those vulnerabilities. That's SBOMs. Tim had mentioned this briefly, so that stands for software bills of materials, just a record of all the components that were used in an application. And SALSA basically plays a similar role for the process side of things that SBOMs play for the ingredient side of things. So that is where a rough comparison can be made. How about open source? So a lot of those attacks really exploit weaknesses in open source, because open source now has become so important in our supply chain because it creates such a wonderful economy of scale. And it's of course free, readily available, but there's now a downside to it. It's also being exploited for cyber attacks. So the status quo is that developers build and publish open source to repositories directly. So they do it on the developer notebooks. And if you consider this in terms of size and maturity levels, that's really on the lowest level, where the developer notebook itself might have a virus and that compromises, for instance, the build. So it's really this ad hoc level. Hosted is the next level up if you use, for instance, GitHub Actions to build and deploy an open source library. That is significantly better because it is much more difficult to attack and to compromise. There's recently a rise of assured open software. So in particular, Google has quite advanced technologies there. So the idea is that organizations like Google identify important open source libraries and independently build them in their infrastructure, maybe with some additional testing, quality assurance, and then create separate repositories of open source components that went through this hardened build process. Oracle is working on a similar project. For Google, that project is actually available. It's even for free at the moment. It's called Google Assured Open Source, and that works for Java and Python components at the moment. Many people might argue at this point that again puts us in a situation where we have to trust a big company such as Google and Oracle, and that's maybe by itself a problem. If you subscribe to this point of view, then there's an alternative. There's an infrastructure developed for decentralized builds with consensus based on blockchains. I only mentioned this here. I think that's more like a prototype. I don't think that's something that's available on a large scale, but maybe that's one potential avenue for the future. I actually believe that companies like Google or Oracle have a very selfish interest in safeguarding the digital infrastructure, including the open source components that are widely used. So I believe that's interest of the wider public and of those big corporations in this particular case are more or less aligned. But that's my personal point of view. You might have a different one. So I want to come back to this idea of reproducible builds and steer this a little bit to our contributions in this Veracity project in our collaboration with Oracle. So the idea of a reproducible build is if you have a build that turns the source code which humans produce into a binary that can be executed on the computer. Well, then you just repeat this process with a second build, and you get another binary, and if they match, and you are quite sure that the environment in which you executed this build is sound, then you say, well, that's supporting evidence that the build has not been compromised and that people can start using it. If you produce a different binary, then maybe a warning sign goes up and that at least warrants further investigation. That is a very simplified picture now, so because in reality, things look more like this. So you have several shades of difference. And now the first insight here is that sometimes we don't really want to use exactly the same build environment to reproduce it, because if you have exactly the same build requirement, it might also have the same weaknesses. For instance, if the compiler has been compromised and we try to reproduce the same build environment to see whether we can get the same binary, then we might use the same compromised compiler. So in a way, having some variation in the built environment and still hoping to get the same binary is actually desirable from the security point of view. So yet, sometimes we see very small differences. Unfortunately, it is almost the case that whenever we build, we see some differences. So this kind of complete bitwise match is almost never the case. For instance, a lot of compilers leave timestamps in those executables. And if you build at different times, you have a different timestamp, so you technically have a different binary. So what you really need is some notion of what's the acceptable difference. So what makes two binaries equivalent, right? How can we establish equivalence now? So there's a couple of options, and I tried really, really hard to visualize them. So the first one is we just look for the bits and for the sequence of bits, and we try to match the bits. And if the sequence of bits are the same, then we have equivalence. I already made this point with this compiler timestamp as an example. That often is not appropriate and often doesn't give us a realistic, useful notion of equivalence, because almost all the time we have different binaries, even though we know they should be equivalent. So that's not useful. That's as a definition of equivalence, it's too strong. What we really want as computer scientists maybe is a notion like this, where we say, well, whenever we have the same input into a program, into two different programs, we get the same outputs. So we would describe this as the same behavior, also two programs having the same semantics. That would be the perfect solution. Unfortunately, computer science tells us that is not possible. So there are certain results, where classical results from the 50s and theoretical computer science that basically tell us we cannot build a program to establish that kind of equivalence. Right? So that is a notion that is theoretically useful, but practically absolutely useless. The next notion is something that is widely used in cybersecurity for malware detection. We try to measure the distance between two binaries. So I tried to visualize it here by putting three binaries at different distances to each other. And then we have a certain threshold, and we say, if it's similar enough, so smaller than the threshold, like those two here, I'll reduce my pointer for this, like those two here, then we consider this equivalent, but those two are too far apart. Then we say it's not equivalent. That is not particularly useful either, because very often it's very small changes that are security relevant. It might just be a single bit. And that notion typically doesn't really capture this very well. The next notion we can try is that we have some sort of transformation where we say, well, we have the binary and transform it into some sort of more abstract representation where we maybe have equivalent sequences of those bits where we know they have the same meaning when the program is executed, and we identify them. So that transform and compare notion is what we think really powerful and promising. There's then, of course, always a completely other version to tackle this, and that is just to use AI. And to build an AI engine, which typically we assume is not available out of the box. It has to be trained. And then we can basically ask an engine, well, we have two binaries, and we ask it, do you think they are equivalent? And we see how fast it takes us. That is something we are working on at the moment. Whatever we do to assess those approaches and to evaluate them and to make research in this space, we need some sort of evaluation. And we have spent a significant amount of resources to create a data set for this purpose. So this data set comprises of two parts. The first part is pairs of binaries, so really pairs as we see here on the slide. Those pairs, usually not that short, usually much longer, several thousands long in many cases, where the two binaries should be equivalent. And we know this because we basically started breeding those binaries by using the same source code, but different build environments. And so there are some numbers here. And I skip a little bit over the details, but our data set at the moment has over 300,000 such pairs of binaries. And they are designed in a way that we have a good level of variability in this data. So we also want to have a notion of binaries that might superficially look like they are equivalent, but should not be equivalent. And so we invested in synthesizing such data sets as well. And again, I will skip a little bit over the details. So we have altogether about 150,000 pairs of such binaries, but they really on 3 different categories, which have fundamentally different types of differences, if that makes sense. So it's really quite hard to explain this and avoiding going into full detail. Yeah, but of course, if there are questions and if somebody's interested to go into full details, we can of course elaborate on this. So now we have tried a couple of tools which are available on those data set and run an evaluation. So we have tried several transformations, such as a decompiler, Fernflower. Some of you might use JetBrain development tools, so that's the decompiler that comes with those tools. Then Java P, that's the Java disassembler. Suit is an academic tool that has been around for a long time. It has an intermediate representation that's quite suitable for that kind of research. We have used TLSH. It's a local sensitive hash that's widely used in malware detection to use kind of malware, detect malware signatures in streams. And none of those tools perform sufficiently well. Some are brittle, some potential to customize and tweak them. For instance, what we have done now is we started to, so I have to go back a little bit, play around with this idea of using those transformations, but basically pipelining and chaining them together. So transforming the binaries and then transforming the results of the transformation again, and that often gives us much better results. So we start creating some really interesting technological solutions in this space based on this baseline evaluation. So there's some ongoing exploration of LLM. One of our students is working on this, and I think Alex is actually in the listening in tonight. So I want to finish this with a little bit of more conceptual work we do in this space, which we think is really, really exciting and promising. So the insight here is that the tools used to establish equivalence must also be trusted and could also be vulnerable. So if you use another tool, let's say like a decompiler, to tell you whether 2 binaries are equivalent in order to establish the trustworthiness to your build pipeline, then you also have to trust this decompiler, and the decompiler potentially also becomes the source of weakness, of vulnerability in your tool chain. So we therefore came up with this idea of equivalence levels that depend on the complexity of equivalent patterns. So really match certain sequences in binaries and consider them equivalent. And the more complex that is, the higher that level of equivalence is. And that somehow corresponds to the complexity of tools, such as transformations you need in order to establish the equivalence. So we have a notion, from this we can derive a notion of trust in the security relevant statements we derive with our tooling. So that's very similar to software source code clone level. Some of you might have heard about this. So that ranges from trivial to complex, and that has a very wide range of application. Software clone detection is widely used in practice, actually in commercial as well as open source applications for license violation detection, vulnerability detection, and actually everybody who went through university computer science departments probably also remembers that it's widely used for plagiarism detection. So that's the last slide. So interestingly, the picture that is emerging is that we have a Pareto front of assurance, if you want. And what I mean by this is the following: we can either go in with 2 very similar builds, and I try to visualize this here with those 2 arrows that are close together, and we get 2 binaries that are likely to be very, very similar, because we basically use the same cooking method with the same ingredients, so we get the same output. And in a way, that gives us a very weak statement, because if the build environment is very similar, we are unlikely to detect flaws in a build. So, but the level of trust we have is very, very high, because if the bit sequences are very, very similar and we don't really have to do this complex transformation to match those patterns, we have a very high level of trust that those 2 programs really represent the same source code. So, and that is useful. So we create a security relevant statement that has low value but high trust. On the other hand, we can also use the opposite approach, where we say, well, we go in with a fundamentally different build tool. We may use a completely different compiler from a different company. That is likely to give us a very different set of binaries, which are then difficult to compare. So we have a very high value statement, but the trust in the statement is very, very low. So we have high value and low trust. And I believe where we have to work towards too is a clever combination alongside this Pareto front of assurance to build tooling to safeguard software builds and to make sure that we detect vulnerabilities as they occur. And that's all from me. It probably took far too long. I'm horrified that
No,
it's
it's all
already
good. That's all
5 to
excellent.
8 years already,
That's
David.
fine.
I got
Thank you
carried
very
away.
much.
Yeah,
That's not a problem. It's all good. No,
yeah,
it's all fine. So
yeah.
we'd be very keen to collect questions that people have, but also just before we get even to that, Judith is on the call, who's another researcher that's been involved with the Veracity project, and she's soon carrying out some interviews that are looking at Veracity debt, a kind of concept capturing where suboptimal decisions are made requiring involving Veracity requirements in software. So I'm just going to invite her to paste into the chat for this Zoom call a link out to ways you can participate in that research as well. So all very organized. Judith has already done that, so that's all good. Now, does anyone want to raise hands or otherwise jump on to ask questions of either speakers? Again, we don't have to terminate at 8 unless your Zoom call, Jens, is going to cut us off, but I don't think it will. So I think we can stay online, but I just thought it would be good to get the recording covering all of the material within that first hour. Is there anyone who wants to ask a question? I have plenty of questions, but that's not the point of tonight entirely. If anyone wants to raise hands, or I will also be looking in the chat window, because otherwise, if you don't jump in, I will ask questions instead. We've got a hand up. Yes, George, do you want to just jump on? You're on audio already. Go for it. We can't hear you yet, so feel free to type if you Zoom is interfering with your audio. I think you're mute. Oh, there we go. I think we got audio now.
Awesome. Hi, guys. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Thank you very much for the talks. They were really interesting. I've got a quick couple of questions for you, Tim, if I may. First one is, if I've understood the process correctly there, you need to create a POV for every vulnerability. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So that's part of the input to our tool. Yes.
Yeah. So
it's not strictly strictly necessary, but the approach we've taken is to focus on those for now, and that gives us higher certainty about the results.
Okay. As far as operationalizing this, do you see that as something that in future could be automated from existing POC code for vulnerabilities, or is that something that's likely to remain quite a manual process?
We would very much like to do that. We would like to make it as automatic as possible. And there is some ongoing research by others in this area to try and basically to automatically create those POC code snippets, and even to extract them automatically from threads on GitHub and that sort of thing. Because yeah, that's a rich source of input for us.
Awesome. Thank you.
Sure.
Very good. Thank you for those questions. Are there other questions that people want to raise? So Tim, I might fire one at you as well, and then Jens have the same, which is, I guess in some sense, I'm interested in whether there's also the ability to try to encourage a sort of purposeful shading. Like at the moment, part of the problem is you've got to find the needle in the haystack, because shading happens in whatever way is necessary to fix the kind of Java problems you're working around. But I mean, it's the type of thing where if there was an agreed convention of how to do that, I wonder if you think there'd be sort of mileage to have that almost be like a coding style where you kind of feed a solution in from the beginning all the way through, whether that would actually help in this case.
Well, the interesting thing is that there kind of already is. So there's already a Maven plugin. Is it the assembly plugin, or maybe the shading plugin? I think that there is a Maven shading plugin, which is the purpose of that is to enable a more principled form of shading. But for whatever reason, not everybody chooses to drive on the left-hand side of the road. Some people want to go off-road. for whatever reason. Yeah, so had everybody used that tool, we wouldn't have any results, I suppose, but we would be in a stronger security position in the Java ecosystem.
Very good. Although, I mean, of course, someone might shade that actual plugin, and
Yeah.
then you could go searching for that instead.
It's shading all the way down.
If I can add something.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I posted a link to the shade plugin in the chat if somebody wants to have a look. Look, the shade plugin itself has to perform some static program analysis. Because at the moment you rename something, you rename the packages, you also have to rename the references to the packages.
Yep.
So static analysis is something like whole graph construction is known to be unsound because Java programmers, as many other programmers, use magic like reflection and proxies and things like this. So if you have complex code, the shading plugin might actually fail.
Yep.
It will produce some code, but the code has not the same semantics as the original program. So it changes some of the behavior because it doesn't see certain things in its analysis. So we had an earlier science challenge project where we quantified this and we had an ICSI paper and so on. We did a lot of research in this space. So I believe there is a valid use case that people say, what I try to shade is so complex that the shading plugin doesn't actually do this, that it fails, that it doesn't map the semantic correctly. So I have to do it manually. So
Yep,
in many
that's
cases, Tim, you're probably right. Developers should use the shade plugin and they could for their particular project, but there is a use case that goes beyond this, where the shade plugin just wouldn't cut it anymore.
very cool.
Yeah, it's an interesting question now in the projects we see that are kind of shaded without the plugin, how often that is the case, how often people use it for the right reasons. Yeah, that is an open question. We don't know what the answer is.
But that'd be a really nice extra piece of work on the site, I guess, is to look and say, could these have been done in that way? That's very nice. Very good. Other questions? I'm keeping an eye on chat as well. I wonder, here we go. We got a question from Angus. Where are the vulnerabilities coming from that you're testing against?
I guess I'll take this. So the vulnerabilities in general, I think, are being reported by, like, they originate from security researchers all over the world, whether they are just hobbyists or working for a company, maybe as a red team, trying to, find their way inside a company's firewall. But where we get them from is from the large vulnerability databases. So GitHub has their GHSAs. The CVE databases from the NVD website. I couldn't tell you exactly what that stands for. National Vulnerability Database.
Yeah.
And there's various of these kind of vulnerability databases out there which more or less make partial copies of each other and kind of synchronize with each other in various ways. But that's the origin that we use for the vulnerabilities themselves. And if we want, for the proof of vulnerability code, we've constructed some of those ourselves, or we've been able to lean on some existing projects like Vol4j, who've provided those POV code pieces themselves.
Very good. And so another question, does New Zealand have specific vulnerabilities compared to the rest of the world? This is something that actually came up at the meeting that we had, and Stephen as well. I remember it being mentioned by some of the others who are actually also on this call, as it happens. The discussion is that I'm not sure that we necessarily would have New Zealand specific vulnerabilities, although obviously if you have New Zealand code bases or maintainers of code that are in New Zealand, which we certainly will have, then that might change the focus. But apparently there is a degree to which New Zealand is seen as an interesting place to try to attack, because in terms of its kind of maturity of the social structure, but again, possibly the underfunding of security teams or something and organizations. I think it was seen as being a place to actually test out certain types of attacks, because it was seen that this was worth doing, that it just wasn't necessarily a place that was reacting to those vulnerabilities being tested being noticed, and so actually that made it a good testing ground before you then go and attack the US or whatever. Presupposing you're not the US, you're the US, you go off and attack, China or whoever, those sorts of things. So I think that's kind of an indirect answer. I don't know that I'm aware of there being New Zealand specific vulnerabilities, but New Zealand is in an interesting space when it comes to cybersecurity.
I'm not aware of this, and I'm not aware that there's any local database. So the database we are dealing with are typically maintained either by the US government, that's the National Vulnerability Database, by private companies. Tim talked several times about this GitHub Security Advisory database, so that's run by Microsoft indirectly. Other security firms have their own vulnerability databases because they try to add value to those to get a commercial advantage selling their security tools. There's probably a scenario where you could see that there are some New Zealand specific vulnerabilities. Let's say somebody would exploit something in the library that does Maori language bindings or something, maybe. I don't know. But that's a niche scenario, I would say. Generally, the world of software is so interconnected and so networked that you don't see a lot of those local effects. So everything quickly becomes globalized. Yeah.
Very good.
I'm not sure that's a good answer, Karen, but it's the best I have at this point in time. Yeah.
So another question for you then, Jens, if you don't mind, from me. What number of pairs do you think is going to be good, sufficiently good for the type of training that you want to do with your AI models? I mean, have you stopped because you've already got the number of pairs that you need, or is there a kind of linear trade-off, or is it even hard to estimate?
I think to some extent we stopped because it's computationally quite expensive to do this.
Okay. Yeah.
But I think there's something fundamentally very interesting in there, as we are creating a large synthetic data set, and I recently heard something about AI running out of data, and the future is now synthetic data sets, and that's where the value is. And I thought, yeah, that's basically exactly what we are doing. So it's computationally very, very expensive what we do. So it takes weeks and weeks of computing time to do this. To answer your question, of course, we use those data for two different purposes. At the moment, we mainly use it for testing. So we have existing tools, we test this on the data, and the data is at least good enough to differentiate those tools and to reveal weaknesses of those tools we have not expected. I just want to give you a glimpse of this. So there's a really good academic tool based on the suit frameworks that performs quite well. But the way those tools are supposed to perform is you give it two binaries and you just want a yes or no answer. It's very simple at this level. But in a way, there's a third situation that's the tool that's just falling apart in an error because it cannot process the input. And so for this tool that actually happens quite often. And then we found that it's a library that itself does bytecode analysis and doesn't really compile all of its bytecode, but it uses some bytecode for testing that is compiled with different compilers. So it looks like code, but it's basically test data. But then that derails the code of this analysis tools we are using. So I guess the wider point I want to make is we find really, really interesting niche cases, and you only get this if you have a rich data set. Yeah. Of course, now the question is, if we add to the data set, will we find more? We don't find yet. Possibly. Yeah.
But it also doesn't matter when adding anything is already allowing you to find interesting things.
Yeah. I mean, at some stage, you could even think about, let's say, that approach we follow now becomes mainstream. Let's say with something that is AI-based. And of course, for AI, at the moment, we use it for training and for testing. Then you have a better notion of when your data set is large enough because you have cross-validation, right? So that gives you probably a better notion of when you're there. But let's say that becomes mainstream. I believe that eventually what we will start seeing is that people start writing malicious code to attack analysis tools like this.
Sure.
We are not there yet, but that is kind of the future I'm predicting. So that we get into this kind of arms race situation between building analysis tools, but then also having attackers that understand how those tools work and try to derail them very, very purposeful manner. Yeah. So that's for the next generation of security researchers, but you can see those arm race cycles really.
Sure. And that's very good for research because it means you can just keep going. This is
Yeah,
good.
but it also has to be going. There's kind of almost no alternative to
Yeah,
this
no,
at this
sure,
moment.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, Stephen.
Thanks, David. Thanks, guys. Yeah, two great talks. And the question's really for both of you, and then I'll divert to Tim first. So you're talking a lot about finding as many instances of vulnerabilities or issues as possible, but is the point as much to find different ones that are not being found? So Tim, why I was thinking of your results is, you said we were finding more, but is it actually a need to use multiple tools because you're finding different instances of different vulnerabilities rather than, or are you finding a superset? You're getting them all and others are just getting some of them.
That's a good question. Are we finding a superset? Well, we have only tested in our results and shown in our results there the one on the set that we have found. But I think I can't answer that directly, actually. But so certainly in terms of like the existing tools, yes, they don't all find the same set, and none of the existing tools finds a superset of all of the others, or there's no such simple structure like that. And yeah, I would say that I'm very certain that the additional instances of those existing vulnerabilities that we find, so like a vulnerability with a particular CVE number, the additional artifacts that we find that are vulnerable to that CVE will not be found by any of those existing tools just based on how we know that they work. Until such time as somebody updates the database, what will eventually happen is that as people discover intermittently that these other artifacts that we find are in fact vulnerable, they will add them to the database as individual records, and at that point those tools will start to report them as well. But yeah.
Very good. There's another question coming in. Is there such a thing as a secure software supply chain, or at best is it temporary? Well,
Very good question. Jens, you want to?
No, I think that comes back to this thought we had mentioned earlier, that there's an arms race. Yeah. And the tool will get better, but also the attacks will become more sophisticated. I think we are now, there's different ways to see this. Let's say from our point of view as security researchers, it's almost like a gold rush, because there have been so many very, very obvious vulnerabilities, and the software we built in the last 20 years or so was completely unprepared and unprotected from this. And that's why you have so many companies creating new products in this space and so much venture capital actually flowing into this. So recently I came across a company that operates in this space, which is a spin-off of Delft in the Netherlands. And they just like a $60 million investment, US dollars. Yeah, so there's significant capital flowing into this. And that will take us so far, but then again, the attacks will also become more sophisticated. And you can see this in this XZ attack I mentioned earlier. So that was somebody starting to pay somebody to do this, starting 4 years or 3 years ago. There's such a level of sophistication to launch those attacks that I somehow have this gut feeling that with the vulnerabilities we have detected, we are probably still like 1 or 2 years behind. There's more really big stuff looking out there, which we haven't found yet. So even if we implement like SALSA and SBOMs and everything, we will not capture all vulnerabilities, but we will make a good job if we capture like 80% of those, So I think implicitly I'm referring to this 80-20 rule, with 20% investment, you address 80% of the problems. Yeah. So maybe that is more what it is at the moment. And once we have done this, we move on to the next 20%. I mean, we're definitely driving up the cost of the attackers.
Yep.
You're not making it impossible, but we drive up the cost of doing this. And now some of the really sophisticated attacks almost certainly need state actors backing or big corporate actors backing up the
Although
attacks.
there's no shortage of states, and many of them are quite big. So yeah, but yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it?
Yeah,
Just an
yeah,
ongoing
unfortunately, yeah.
situation. So I'm aware of the time. George, you've got a question to ask as well. I think eventually we probably want to. I don't want to shut these things down. And again, the other point, which is very important to raise, is that Veracity as a project has a symposium that's coming up in June. So Brendan, what's the date? June 5th, isn't it? The information's on the website for the project, which I can paste, and actually, Brendan, if you've got it handy, you can paste into chat. So that will get more information as we keep forming up the way that the different strands of Veracity project come together, including these ones. But sorry, George, I've been keeping you waiting for some time. Feel free to ask your question.
No, thank you. Sorry, I noticed, Tim, in your study, your comparison was strictly against static application testing tools. Have you done any testing against dynamic tools? And if not, do you have any idea how you think you'd compare?
We haven't done any against dynamic tools, no. So I think Eclipse Steady, Jens, correct me if I'm wrong, does Steady do some kind of, it does code path analysis on some level, but it's rather out of date. That was one of the tools that we used. But that's also that's a static.
It's a static tool, yeah.
Yeah.
I think the closest I could think of would be Google OSS FAS.
Yeah, the thinking there being that obviously the static tools, as you say, are looking against effectively a tree, whereas the dynamic tool actually look at runtimes that hopefully would pick up some of that shading. Probably not all, but possibly some.
Yes.
Okay, so I believe, George, what happens here is some of the vulnerabilities we investigated were actually originally discovered by OSS FAS on the original component. That was, from memory, the case for a snake YAML vulnerability we have in the dataset, and for one for JSON.org. I don't know what the CVE is. That was the one you might remember that had actually the XML parser embedded in the JSON parser. It's details now. It doesn't really matter. So Google runs a fuzzer that creates random input in a fairly clever way to fire against public open source libraries, and sometimes they cause errors, and sometimes those errors then result in vulnerabilities being reported and added to the database. The way that works is, say, prioritize prominent open source projects, and that relates back to this assured open source product Google has, I mentioned earlier. So let's say we have the official JSON library, JSON.org. So they discovered a vulnerability, reported it, and discovered it with their dynamic tool. So the shaded clones where we detected the vulnerability are not in this A level of open source components that are kind of one tier down. You know, the clones are typically produced to be embedded in a specific product, but they are not that popular in the sense that they are used by a lot of other people. They're still in the repositories, they can be used. Nobody stops you from doing this. It's just not very likely. So the tool does not run on those clones. If the tool would run off those clones, it will also detect this. But the open source puzzle just doesn't run on those tools. Does this make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Jens.
Yeah.
Very good. So I think if we don't have any burning questions, it's not as if we all vanish off the planet unless, you know, the security forces have been listening and, you know, we've said the wrong things in the wrong way, or Google's open source projects or whatever. But I think we're okay because the Digital Markets Act from the EU can protect us against, you know, Google's monopoly on secure, reproducible software builds. It's all good. Thank you very, very much, Jens and Tim, for presenting. It's really excellent to have that work explained in such a clear way. The recording we can make available for others to see who weren't here tonight. So we'll treat this as a resource linked from the website. I've linked from the chat window. We have a symposium coming up for Veracity as well, where we'll explore more broadly many of these sorts of issues. And again, I'd just like to thank everyone for the questions and for coming along this evening. And I would say we will probably wrap it up and call it an evening, and we hope to cross paths with all of you soon. Thank you again very much.
Yeah. Thank you for moderating, and thanks everybody for coming.
It was a pleasure. Good.
Thanks, everyone.
Good. Thanks,
Cool.
everyone.
Thanks, David. Thanks,
Bye.
Brendan. Thanks,
Thank you.
Jens and Tim.
All right, well, bye.
Good night.